The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thanks so much, Sergio. And yes, I agree. If you have a copy, buy another one. If you don't have one, you need to get one. The book is beautiful. It looks slim, but it's deceptively slim. There's so much in these pages that I can just sit here and just have this conversation for you days together, like parse each line. But if I can beg of your indulgence and the audience's, can I just begin with the color blue? When Sergio asked me for this, I immediately said yes, because blue happens to be my favorite color. Now, why it is, I don't know. I have no facts to back this. All I know is that when I look at my closet, it's mostly blue. And whenever I'm looking at another sari, and I have a lot of saris, I normally will gravitate towards blue, and now have physically stop myself from going towards blue because I've run out of the shades. I used to be able to say, okay, I don't have that shade. Right. So I've run out of the shades. And plus my mother is like, you're not buying another sari and you're not buying another blue sari. But I bought this one despite that. And I thought this was good for today because we have the color indigo in it as well as some other different colors. But I wanted to start our conversation today with you doing just a small little reading of one chapter, which I think will set the stage really well. So could we have you read?
Of course. But let me begin just by saying thank you all for being here, and it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. Excuse me. This is Writing in Color. In the beginning, when I was just calling this my blue book, I read books and essays about colors. I loved how the writers ran through the science, symbols, and feelings associated with various hues. Some of these works read more like ornamental lists than narratives, and as much as I enjoyed them, I knew my task was different from their authors. I didn't want to write an exegesis on blue. I realized I wanted to write toward the mystery of blue and its alchemy in the lives of Black folk. As far back as I can remember, I was aware of belonging to a group for whom the word color was potent. The color of your skin, colored people, colorful people, and people of color are all phrases that are associated with us Black Americans. And while black is our nominal color, even though our bodies range from alabaster to jet, the blues are our sensibility. Hence the designation made famous by the writer Amiri Baraka, blues people. Like most of my skinfolk, I would guess, I have an intuitive sense of what it means to be Black. But when I have tried to use my scholarly training to offer accounts of the how and why we are this, for lack of a better word, thing, my descriptions feel distorting. Disquisitions about the political economy, about race as an ideology and/or social construct of modernity, something a little bit phenotypic, brown, coily-haired, but not completely reducible to that at all, genealogical, but certainly not biological, an existence born of empire, ships, captivity, colonies, and trade, a living molded by bias and bigotry, all of it feels too clinical. These concepts can't fully capture important truths, like how it was that people held in the bottoms of slave ships survived so many figurative shipwrecks, and literal ones too. Academic descriptions of Blackness fail to explain how at the heart of being Black is a testimony about the universal power of existence. I wanted to write you and me something more. I wanted to offer truth with a heartbeat, and so I steadily collected Black stories of blue and the blues, both literal and figurative. As I plotted them out, I found that my collection of tales was already bound together in a tight weave. I wasn't constructing a story. I was revealing and witnessing, quilting something present. Along the way, I learned so much more than I already knew about what it means to be a blues people. Events, artifacts, sound, color, breath, death, and depth spoke to me and through me, and that is this book. In it, loose threads and frayed patches are as important as seamless compositions and straight-stitched stories, perhaps more so, because life is neither tidy nor done. It is doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if I may pick up one stitch from that quilt.
Yes.
And let's start at the beginning. This is in your grandmother's bedroom. So can we
Yeah.
talk about the beginnings of blue? How did the blues or the blue start for you?
Yeah, so the book literally begins in my grandmother's bedroom, which is where my life began in many ways, in Birmingham, Alabama. My grandmother had, and I use the past tense because somewhat devastatingly, that home burned down the night before my first book event. So the center, it really was a center of my sense of home. And so now in many ways I think sort of the book has now become the home for that home that is absent. But the bedroom was she converted the dining room, she and my grandfather had passed before I was born, converted the dining room into their bedroom. So the bedroom is in the center of the house.
Right.
And it was all blue walls, blue bedspread, blue curtains, the little sort of prayers that were written and put into the corner of her vanity, written in blue. And so I talk about how that blue innocence was a portal. It was a pathway through which I saw the world. And of course, there's a kind of safety and intimacy and care in that space, kind of love, protective love, but it was also, as an intimate space, was a place through which we all confronted our experience of the blues, of heartbreak, of devastation, that relative safeness doesn't mean that you aren't also dealing with the difficult stuff of life. And so that is the beginning. That's the space through which I saw and understood the world. And at the beginning of the book, I'm sitting with my cousin's son, Ian.
Right.
He was very small then. He was still, but a brilliant child. And I asked him, what's your favorite color? Blue, Ian, because he likes blue like I do. And there was a ceiling tile that was missing in the ceiling.
And why was it missing?
It was missing because, some shenanigans. Somebody had done something, but it was, the ceiling had been dropped to save on heating costs, and somebody had messed with the ceiling tile. So there was an opening. There's a kind of aperture, and so he pointed up to the ceiling and he said, "That one." And that blue was actually the original blue that she had painted the room. Was a more brilliant blue, something closer to the sky. And it's just one of these moments that occurred in that very precious room that resonated so deeply with me, to sort of the pointing up and saying that one right there. And so that's where we began, and that's where I began. Yeah. So.
Speaking of the book, though, I understand that in an interview I heard you talk about how you were thinking about this book as you were, writing South to America.
Yes.
This book took a while to write, but you'd been thinking about it a while earlier. Could you talk about what got you started with those, those ideas and how you started collecting these thoughts?
Well, it is, in both instances, a sense of home, right? So South to America is a journey through the Southland, where I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and this book begins there too. And in both works are kind of these journeys of contending with the difficulty of history and the complex of emotions and experiences that exist in that confrontation with history. But I don't tend to sort of sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to write this book, and now I'm going to write this book. Everything is sort of a sort of complex stew. And one of the things I say in this book, I talk about hoodoo, the kind of folk spiritual practices that have a particular form in the southeast corner of the United States. And the hoodoo is a very iconoclastic kind of spiritual practice. It doesn't even necessarily fit tidily into the spiritual. It spells and it's spiritual, but it's also medicinal, but it's also, like social practices. It has all of these pieces. It's very kind of promiscuous in its form. It's also associative. And that's sort of my approach to writing and thinking. I have a kind of associative practice. So I pick up threads. I have this and that, and they sort of coalesce over time. So when I actually looked recently, I have several spiritual altars in my home. And we do this sort of dressing or cleansing of altars. It's sort of a hoodoo practice, but I actually was cleaning things and saw that I had South to America and this book written on a piece of paper at the same, which I completely forgot many years ago. So it is a sort of, kind of go back and fetch it, Sankofa. I keep going back to a series of questions. And part of it is simply sort of how do people survive and create so much beauty despite every manner of violence and adversity. That's probably the core question, and I want to ask it because I want us to use that as we move forward. So I'm both interested in tending to the past in a more ethical way than people were tended to in the past, but also tending to the present for the future informed by that past. Yeah.
So you had initially thought of the book as a series of essays, and then decided that that's not going to work, and we're going to impose a structure.
Yeah, it needed to be a story, and so there's a chronology to it, even though each section has a somewhat different form. So there's a way in which I'm trying to compose it like a work of music, like a piece of music. So rhythm and cadence and style are very important, but it is a historic arc over over hundreds of years, where we stop in certain places and ask questions and walk around. I call it haunting the past. We like going and looking around in the past and trying to pay attention, but also trouble some things. So the chronology sort of offers it some structure, but it also is what you need for some sense of narrativity.
So you begin in Liberia. Could you take us there? Why? And there's this really evocative story that you tell. Could you tell us about that? Because I have something to add to that story.
Yeah, so I let me see how I want to anchor it. So I found this story. Part of the writing of this book was a sort of process of discovery. And I found this story that was a recording of a Liberian folktale that a white American woman had done when she was living there. She was married to a Firestone tire executive, and Firestone did horrific things in Liberia. And this woman named Esther, which is there's a sort of echo with South to America too, which is because I talk about an ancestor named Esther that's the beginning point of that book. But Esther Warner, so she tells the story that is about the origin of indigo. And it is it's a really powerful story that for me, the core of it is about the dangers of a desire for beauty leading to cruelty, which is so much about what the history of empire is about. It's both the desire for wealth and acquisition, but it's also the kind of perversion of desire for things that are beautiful that allow you to behave in very ugly ways. And so this is a kind of folktale that does that. And so I actually did a kind of rewriting of it, and I wanted to raise the question in a variety of ways about the history of Liberia is a story of when the formerly enslaved return and become colonizers, right? And the way in which the oppressed can become oppressors, but also for me, grappling with the fact that I, as an American, wanted to take possession of this story as someone who exists in this sort of this nation that dominates so many across the globe, but also as a cousin of Liberia, a descendant of the people, right? And that kind of tension, I think is something that ethically is important to sit with. Because at the end of the day, right, I can talk about descending from this legacy of being of a people dominated many times over. But what I want to do is actually both testify to that history in a way that is ethical, that makes demands upon me as much as anyone else about how to be a decent person in the world. I think that's what, that is a kind of mature relationship to history, but also to what it means to be a person of conscience in the world. So this folktale, my rewriting of it becomes a way to grapple with all of those things. But it's also, to deal with the fact that, indigo is so beautiful, and the desire for it is so voracious that it led to incredible cruelty. Yeah.
It's a fascinating story, which you should all buy the book and read. But one of the reasons I love this book is because, as I said, I love blue, but it has me reconsidering and renegotiating my relationship with blue, right? And why blue is in my own mythology. So, for instance, you have that story about a woman who eats up the sky. And so, in our mythology, in Indian mythology, we have a creation story in which the ocean is milked for various reasons. And then out of all the wonders that come out of the ocean, which includes, the nectar of immortality and jewels and all of that, also comes poison. And so what to do with poison, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when one of the Trinity of ours, Shiva, who's the Lord of Destruction, drinks the poison and holds it in his throat. And his throat becomes blue. So there is that. There are also all of these stories about, our gods, like Vishnu, who has blue skin, or Krishna, who is blue-skinned, and blue almost to the point of black.
Yes.
And it's fascinating to me because, as you are well aware, and I'm sure many other people are, we have, a terrible system in our, of enumeration of caste, where in which the black is not, like, it's impure, but at the same time, our gods are blue and black. So I find it fascinating, these kind of, threads that connect us in a way.
Yeah, and I love that you reference that, because part of what, for me, the desire to do this, I mean, this is a particular history and a particular set of stories here, but I'm really interested in the kind of arterial connections to human experience writ large. I mean, what is it, so the particular that actually allows some universally important questions to emerge, right? And so I love, I'm always hoping for borrowing from music, would term sympathetic vibration, the way that there's a resonance that happens. Yeah.
So speaking of those arterial connections, indigo is another one.
Yes.
So could we talk about indigo? Like it's and you sort of go into its various histories in this. It's a long history, but you've managed to capture its terror and its beauty. So could you talk a little bit about digging into indigo?
Yeah. I mean, so there's, in some ways, the way where it starts for me is the history of indigo in South Carolina. And this young woman, Eliza Pinckney, who ran a plantation. It was originally from Antigua. She's a European woman, child really. She's an adolescent when she first comes in. She's indulged, she's very precocious, and she's given this plantation to run, and she wants to cultivate indigo, which has been cultivated successfully in various parts of the Caribbean, and she's struggling with it, and can't quite figure it out. And so I know her name because she's really celebrated in South Carolina, right? As a person who brought indigo to South Carolina, and it was so lucrative. But as I engaged in this sort of research, it becomes clear she did not figure this out. An enslaved man figured it out. He was brought from somewhere else in order to figure it out. We know it was part of the Francophone Caribbean, but it's not even identified, right, where precisely he was from. But also, and he facilitated her building this wealth off of indigo. And that's part of racialization, right? That story becomes really important because the exploitation of his knowledge to develop this crop and him going unnamed is part of the story of what it meant to become black in the Age of Empire. And so uncovering that was really important. But then going, in some ways, and then that led me to go back even further to think about the cultivation of indigo on the African continent and how the transition from people who were cultivating indigo to a slave trade in which human beings were sold for indigo, right? That too is part of the tragedy of modernity. And yet, and this becomes another piece of the thread of the book, you still have this love of indigo amongst black people in the Americas, including those who were enslaved. So, one of my favorite details that I wound up putting in the book of encountering in the archives, this fabric trader who is kind of annoyed because he's selling fabric to plantation owners, and one says, listen, you have to give me blue fabric because these women, these enslaved women, don't want to wear anything else, right? And I just, so just that insistence upon taste and a sense of beauty in the face of being rendered chattel, that is part of the story that's really important for me because there's an insistence upon humanity, even in the face. And that too is part of, there's a way in which the imposition, becoming black as opposed to all the other things that people were, the identities, the language, the ethnicities, right, all of these things, this category, which was meant as a kind of indignity, being written out of world history and the like, and yet people made meaning under that sign and continued to attest to their humanity and rebuilt cultures and rebuilt senses of meaning, right? That to me is such an essential part of the story too. So indigo becomes this way of talking about all of those things at once, and it's a kind of historical narrative, but also as a set of kind of philosophical questions about, what does it mean to be? How do we make sense of the desire for culture, of taste and the like? So, yeah.
Yeah, and again, in a way of connection, I was telling you before, when I read about indigo, like one of the earliest histories that we were taught as students in India was of the cultivation of indigo in India, like as a colonial type of a thing. And one of the ways in which Gandhi, one of the many civil actions, civil disobediences that he did was protesting the cultivation of indigo because it was wiping out the farmers, like the plantations were just terrible.
And it's an extreme, and that was part of, for me, it was important to talk about too because it's awful, like the conditions under which it's cultivated. It's toxic, it's dizzying, it does a lot of damage. So I also wanted to capture that because, we see something beautiful and we often don't realize what are the conditions to create it.
But also what was fascinating for me, and this is something I think that, you talk about lessons from the past for us today, is what you just referred to in terms of the construction of a people or the race, right? Like, so could you talk a little bit about that? Because it was fun. It's like oftentimes, I don't know how many times my friends have had to say this, where they sort of say, Africa is not a country,
right?
It's a continent. But even beyond that, you sort of point out to these even older origins. So could you talk a little bit about that construction, the artificial construction of race? In that sense?
Well, because I think what we find is, there's one critique, and it's a completely accurate critique, right? That there's under this signifier, black, right? Lots of complexity, right? Literally hundreds of languages and various ways in which people conceived of themselves. It's collapsed. And it's collapsed in the service of this category that is meant as a sign of indignity and an inferior humanity and the like. And yet, people create in the face of that, right? And so, one of the ways I talk about it is creating beauty at the site of wound. So I'm not a person, and this also may have everything to do, as a Black American, my identity is forged in the very core of this violence, right? So there's a reason why I'm attached to it. But I'm interested in what does it mean to make oneself in the face of the violence and the wound, and to make oneself beautiful and complex, and to create a language and to reconstitute a conception of self in the face of that. And what we see is that happens in different iterations all over the world in ways that then become sort of connections and echoes, so that there is something global, even as they're very distinct forms of identities and histories, right? There's some thread of connection, because here are all these people contending with modernity and the way modernity is trying to render Blackness as something inferior. So there's sort of literal historic connections, but then there's also a conceptual sort of framework that various peoples are dealing with. So in the book, for example, what this means for me is I trace a relationship or a journey from Congo culture, which is one of the primary cultural influences of African Americans, a sort of origin point, and the sort of history of the relationship between the Congo and the Portuguese, to the way that culture shows up and is sort of reimagined and mixed and blended in this southern part of the United States, through the way in which, the Congolese liberation movement and the story of Patrice Lumumba has this direct resonance with the African American political imagination in the mid-20th century, so that there's this repetition. Part of it is genealogy, part of it is history, part of it is meaning making. Different peoples imagining freedom. So I'm trying to sort of hold on to those pieces, because I think that's, we situate ourselves in so many different ways, and so I'm not interested in sort of imposing upon people one way or the other, but I actually am interested in this question of how people make something of themselves that is significant and beautiful and sustaining. But in light of the horrors of history. Yeah.
This is a little out of the blue, but sorry, couldn't help it.
Perfect.
Just something that I've been mulling over myself in relation to what we've been in contemporary times dealing with this very, so there is this diverse history that you're talking about, and these different threads and that sense of identities within an identity.
Yeah.
And yet we're at a stage where there is a sense of nationalism, and there is this sense of wanting to have this one identity. And I kind of wonder what lessons from the past can we take as we step into this moment that we're in right now.
I like the way James Baldwin put it. He said we should wear identity as a loose garment. And so it's there, but, underneath it is our nakedness, which I think is something that if we can acknowledge that in each other, we actually become more sensitive, more decent, more humane. So, and nationalisms are dangerous. They are sometimes necessary as a way of organizing an analysis of social and political forces, so something that can be useful, but again, loose garment, You know.
So speaking of Baldwin, there are many other authors that you refer to in the book. There is Toni Morrison, there's Zora Neale Hurston, and there's so many. Could you talk a little bit, I mean, Toni Morrison, my God.
Yeah.
Like jazz is still one of those books that I read over and over again. But you talk about another book in here, The Bluest Eye.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about Morrison and blue?
Yeah, so Morrison, it's one of those aspects of her work that I think actually gets inadequate attention, is the color is so important. And again, it's another one of those, you know, one is the blues and blues motifs throughout her work. There's a section of, I'm sorry, I'm talking about a different book, but I'll get to Blue Side, but in Home, where which is one of the few books that is sort of much more clearly oriented in the U.S. South than the others. She is she's from the Midwest, but there's a point where Frank turns on the radio and it's playing this blues song, Lottie, Miss Claudie. And there's something about when you're reading it, if you know the song, it comes into your head in this moment in this book where he's returning home. And there's sort of blues sensibility that's present in her work, is this recurrent theme, but also the way Morrison engages with colors also is frequently influenced by Yoruba color symbolism. And so that too, so it's one of those, kind of arterial connections, kind of the root in the U.S. South, but also the a kind of broader connection, which I think is really important. I'm going to try not to go on too many tangents, but it's also important because there's this sort of tension between Morrison and one of the other authors who's highly influential to me, which is Albert Murray, where he tends to be, he was a brilliant critic of the blues and of jazz, but he was like, Black Americans, we are American, we're more like other Americans than anybody else, and then here's Amiri Baraka saying we're unlike all other Americans, and here's Toni Morrison saying, you need to pay attention to the connections of Black Americans to other people. So that I'm trying to have all these conversations at once. But The Bluest Eye, in which this character, this little girl, Pecola Breedlove, who is the most vulnerable person in the community in so many ways, and the community fails her. And her witnesses are these other little girls who see the kind of cruelty she experiences. And this is a novel that on the front, when it was first published, the whole story is on the front page, on the cover literally, where it's just a little girl who is a victim of incest and she's pregnant by her father. And she wants blue eyes. And what Morrison is trying to do in that period is say, okay, black is beautiful is all well and good, but what about when it's not? What about when there's someone who is so who is so subject to violence and devaluation and all the like that it's not hitting that person, and that ethical question about what do we do about that baby girl, right, is to me one of the things that I'm also trying to grapple with, so it's not all beauty, it's also suffering. And for that novel functioning as an example of what I think about is to create beauty at the site of wound, right? She gives us this work of art as a way of contending with something that's incredibly painful, which I think is sort of part of what art allows us to do.
You mentioned in another interview that this was a difficult book for you to teach.
Oh yeah, The Bluest Eye is so hard for me to teach.
Can you talk
I don't like teaching it, in part because it's so easy for readers who are familiar with the deficit narratives of Black people to read Pecola as representative of all Black people. So I always have to, when I teach it, I'm always having to revise, right? The first person account is coming from little girls who are well loved. But they're seeing that the larger community has failed this other little girl. Whereas oftentimes the way people read the story is that vulnerable little girl is a stand-in for the entirety of the community. So you lose the fact that part of what the novel is asking us to do is not just rest on the laurels of the beauty that is experienced by those and the love that's experienced by those who are tended to in the face of, Jim Crow, Depression era context, but also, they have a responsibility within to those who are most vulnerable. So it's like that correction, which is it becomes really hard for talking about experiences of oppressed people in general, right? That they're to not let it all be collapsed into the greatest suffering, but actually allowing us to see the complexity. So it's hard to teach.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you've also mentioned in reference is, out of that terrible time also often comes this amazing art.
Oh, yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about that and contending with blue in that sense, the blues from the blacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something about, and I'll say, so I've thought about this question in different ways in different books. So I wrote a book that was published some years ago called May We Forever Stand, which is a history of the song that's known as the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, in the United States. And one of the things I was focused on in that book is saying, okay, in the post-Reconstruction South, when all of Jim Crow is coming down on people, the promises of Reconstruction, of full citizenship have been rejected, there's the violence of lynching, all of this is, every bit of what was seen as possible in emancipation has been betrayed. And yet, and it's called the nadir in African American studies, it's the kind of lowest point, and yet there's this blooming of culture and art and institutions, and people are writing themselves into history, writing music, building organizations. And so for me to do that historically as a precursor to this book, and then in this book to try to think about, okay, not just the sort of institutional formations, but actually a disposition towards living that became a cultural habit to that art becoming a way of life, an insistence upon one's full humanity, a way of actually beating back the cruelty and the violence of each day by being human, in song, in movement, in expression, in language. Gil Scott-Heron said, for people who love language, there's no better place to come from than the southeast corner of the United States. But even that language itself becoming this space to revel in. So that's a long way of saying, for me, that it's a journey to that kind of recognition that is at the heart of the culture itself. And of course, that's part of how we get blues, which is the cornerstone of American music. Yeah.
I have a few more questions before I need to open it up to the audience, so please have your questions ready. I haven't even gotten to uniforms yet. It's like there's so much to talk about. But just in the interest of that, I might not get a chance to ask this question later. I'm kind of curious, what do you make then of some of our, and you mentioned some contemporary artists, and you were talking about Whitney Houston and among other artists, but I'm kind of curious, what do you make about two things that kind of struck me in recent kind of history. One, when Kendrick Lamar did the, when he had his presentation as part of the Super Bowl, and then they did the flag, right, which is red, white, and blue. But then, the blue is the people. So that I thought was fascinating. When I read your book, I was like, oh, yeah, so there's that. And then much more recently, I haven't seen it. I need to go watch Sinners.
Yeah.
Which has the blues, and it's horror, but it's blues.
Oh,
but
there's a lot of blue in Sinners.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about what you make of these?
They're coming from the same font, same origin, the blues sensibility. So in Sinners, this isn't a spoiler, but there's a character who is a hoodoo woman who has blue beads and is using blue. It's the same cultural origin point as the chapter on hoodoo in this book. And so it's sort of, for me, it's like evidence. See, it's not just me deciding that blue is important. It's all over the place. And I think,
Right.
with Kendrick Dodger blue, I mean, there's a way in which the color becomes imbued with this meaning that has all of these resonances, and that people pick up on. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a full exegesis, like, okay, this symbolizes this symbolizes this, but there's patterns, there's repetitions, and I think there's also a way of, there's a recognition, there's a familiarity, right, that resonates in people. So, okay, this is something, I know this, even if I don't necessarily know it like sort of on an intellectual level, I know it somewhat intuitively, and then I can go and do something with that. Because these are all expressions of imagination, ultimately, you know.
Can I just, I'll just ask one more question before I open it up. Can I just ask about the writing of this book? I mean, there, you mentioned some, it's difficult to read at times because of some of the passages. But it's also beautiful.
Thank
you. Know, like so when you're talking about the hell ships and the passages, there's, it's a terrible image, but it's such beauty in there, which is, I just kind of wondered. And there's also humor. Like there is a time when you talk about a certain story, and you're like, and so there needs to be a narrative, and so there's kind of like little tongue-in-cheek, kind of almost meta, instances in there. Could you talk a little bit about writing? Like it's a terrible history to negotiate, but like you said, there's beauty. So what is that process of trying to capture it?
Well, okay, so I'm going to go back to Morrison for a second. So at the end of Beloved, which is in some ways a terrible story, and it's a beautiful story, there's this repetition of this sentence: it was not a story to pass on. And there's a conundrum there, right? It's oxymoronic, because here she's passing it on, right? Because you're reading it, but it is being passed on, but it's not a story to pass on. And then there's another way of reading it that it's even saying it's not a story to pass by without attending to, right? It's not a story to pass on in that way. And that's really it. It's sort of, how do you contend with the past, right, is an ever-present, I think it's a fundamental human question, right, because the past is just, it's rough, right? So how do you contend with it? And one of the ways is to try to make art, and to make it, to dwell with it in a way that allows us to learn something from it without so completely devastating us that we become immobilized, or so despondent that we don't believe there's something we can do. So that is the challenge of creation. For me, it has also been a transition from, conventional academic writing is about argument. Writing that is art, is about story. And so to take the research aspect of academic writing, right, the sort of deep-seated research, but to be gentle on the question of argument, and to sit in the question of story, and to try to do so in a way that engages the intellect, engages the emotional register, but also taps into this sort of spiritual sensibility, that's the effort, right? And so I'm trying to do some conjuration work in the way that I compose, and pull all those threads together. So it's a hope that it connects enough that it makes people want to stay with it, even though it's tough at times.
But I wonder how you negotiate with that, because there are often times when I read books like yours or others where I'm like, we've been talking about this for a very long time.
Yeah.
How much longer do we need to keep on talking about this?
Oh, so, there's no end, right? So people I think we want to believe, here's how I think about it all the time, right? We talk about like competing historical narratives, right? So one is the story of sort of a forward move, the arc of, what is it? How did King describe it? the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And then the other is, it's all just settler colonialist projects that are going to, and a lost cause narrative and the kind of desperation. The story is of the ongoing battle between the ugliness of modernity and the promise of freedom. It's not ending anytime soon. So we have to sit with it. Some of us want to, make freedom, render it in a way that is as sweet as it actually is, so that people are brought into that side of believing in it, right? So the book is it's an ongoing battle, right? Against what I think of as evil. So I don't know that, I can't imagine that we're gonna be able to stop talking about contending with the ugliness that humanity has engaged in so often. But I just, I don't know if we'll get there, but I do think it's worthy to try and to not give up on the side of freedom,